Episode 12, The Buzzy Gang. All praise belongs to Allah, the Governor, the Protector, the Defender, He who avenges upon the wrong. Verily, I had found evidence that the Almighty Allah, Lord of all the worlds, is watching over my affairs and aiding me in a special way. Oh, Allah, for this special favor, I remain eternally in your debt and thank you from the innermost recesses of my being. Again, I must emphasize that I do not construe this to mean that I am the Mahdi. At this stage I have concluded that Allah Almighty has written something special for me in my destiny, and if it should lead to things beyond my expectations, then so be it. Amen. I realized that I was onto something extraordinary and were determined to come to the bottom of it. I jumped up from my chair and resumed my pacing of the room, asking myself, why? At the same time appealing higher up for the answer or answers to this most intriguing facet of my life. Then I relived my encounter with the Buzzy Gang. As far as I can recollect, the Buzzy Gang were a group of white English-speaking South African males who all grew up and stayed in Lansdowne, the same area as me. In fact, the Buzzies themselves stayed in Scout Street, the next street from mine, which was Hanbury Avenue. I do not know their numerical strength, but at any given moment I would say they were about 10, maybe more or maybe less in number. The few main characters of the gang and from which the other members drew their power and strength were first of all the Buzzy brothers, Reggie and Alan. Reggie, the ringleader, was a soldier in the South African Armed Forces and belonged to the Special Forces Division, whose task was to quell civil unrest. At the time of my encounter with them, Alan had just completed or was still doing military training. Then there were the lieutenants, Percy the squint-eyed and Ricky the boxer. There was another younger brother, Donald Buzzy, with whom I was on a friendly foot. The time I am speaking about, he was not an active member but could have joined the gang at a later stage. This gang was the terror in the local area, and nobody crossed swords willingly or otherwise with them. To do so would ensure the victim got a beating from at least 2 or more members all at the same time. The first time when I came to know that the Buzzy Gang existed was when fate had decreed that I cross swords with them, and I was barely 12 years old at the time. It was on a Sunday afternoon and I was driving my cousin Abraham's Raleigh Sports bicycle. I was on my way to Dale Street, Rondbosch East, where he lived, to return his bike to him. My sister Rakim and I loved cycling, and the two of us would very much have liked to possess our own bicycles, but our father, bless his soul, would have none of it because he believed driving it was dangerous because it offered no cover protection in case of a collision with a motor vehicle. Naturally, we did not share our father's opinion and grabbed every opportunity we could get to go cycling. Lucky for me, Abraham allowed me much use of his bicycle, so I had ample opportunity to indulge in my favorite sport. There I was nonchalantly driving the bicycle up Hanbury Avenue, the road in which I lived. As I neared the top end from the direction of my house, the end which connects to Lansdowne Road, I spied a bunch of boys, maybe 5 or 6, playing with a ball in the road. They were kicking it to one another, and as I approached them I slowed down and steered the bike as near the curb as is possible. To my horror, the boys leapt off, kicking their ball, and all came crowding around the bicycle, effectively blocking off my passage, so that I was forced to come to a halt. Then the tallest and biggest guy, a veritable heavyweight with feet outspread, stood right in front of the bicycle and gripped the handlebars in both his hands. I was in a fix because now all avenues of escape to me was cut off. I was surprised and at the same time frightened by the actions of this crowd, and in a not too steady voice asked them what they wanted from me. To my consternation they all laughed, and Heavyweight told me that now I am not so brave as the other day when I had thrown stones at them. Of course this was not true. but at the same time and up until today I do not know whether it was a case of mistaken identity or whether they were just putting me on just for the hell of it. I vehemently denied this accusation, but they would have none of it, and I could see they were all determined to gang up on me and beat me up. I had enough sense to know that if this should happen I stood a chance of getting fatally injured, so I tried my best to avoid this at all costs. I tried to shame them by telling them that they were cowards. I pointed out that it was the 6 of them against only me, and that the majority of them were not just older than me but also more muscular. I offered to fight any one of them which they so choose, except the heavyweight in hand-to-hand combat. Praise be to Allah, I succeeded in getting them off the idea of all of them beating me up all at the same time and pushed home the advantage. I turned to the nearest one standing next to heavyweight, stared him straight in the eye and asked him to tell me his name. He told me his name is Alan. Then I introduced myself and challenged him to a fair fight, which he declined. Then I turned to the next one and repeated my challenge. He said his name is Rocky, and he also declined. Then on to the next one, whose name turned out to be Percy. He was squint, taller and more well-built than me. Of all those I challenged, I felt that he was the only one who could beat me in a real fight, so I was quite relieved when he also refused to take up my challenge. I challenged them all and they all refused until only heavyweight remained. He spoke up and said his name is Reggie and that he wishes to fight against me. My heart sank inside my chest. This was no match, it was like putting a puppy against a pit bull terrier. I pointed this out to him, but he paid me no heed. He was determined to give me a thrashing, and while I was still talking to him, he punched me with his right fist into the stomach. The shot caught me unawares. He did not put much effort into it. It was a short jab which traveled from the waist and which caught me flush in the solar plexus. Air was expelled out of me like air leaving a balloon which is being deflated, and before I knew it I was on the pavement groping for air like a fish looking for water on dry land. I was completely helpless and entirely at their mercy. Praise and thanks be to Allah. While in this dire strait, I was, so to speak, saved by the bell, because my late uncle Jalaluddin came driving along in his brown Chevrolet panel van. He must have seen me lying on the ground with all these guys standing around me, because he pulled up his van and asked me what is the matter. I had the sense not to involve him in this squabble, and fortunately had recovered enough to blurt out that I was not in any trouble. My uncle chose to believe me. Nevertheless, he pulled slowly away with his van, giving me a chance to grab the bike and be on my way. It was not until 5 years later, when I was 17 years old, that the Buzzy Gang and I crossed paths again. It happened quite innocently and started out like this. I have 2 lifelong friends called Alvin and Patrick. They are both 2 years younger than me. Right from the beginning we were neighbors, but I only made friends with them from the age of 10. The 3 of us had made friends with Johnny Andrews. Actually, it had started with Alvin, who had introduced us to him. Johnny stayed just up the road from us in Scout Street, but his backyard came out into Handberry Avenue, the road in which we lived. Johnny had 3 beautiful sisters in Gwendolyn, Valerie and Veronica. It is not amiss to say that the 3 of us had our eye on them. Johnny's father, Mr. Andrews, had put up a Wendy house in his yard. It abutted onto Handberry Avenue, and every night, Patrick, Alvin, and I would climb through a hole in the fence on our side of the road and slip into the Wendy house. We would meet with Johnny and his sisters and spend the evening socializing with them. We passed the time telling jokes, stories and singing songs. After a while Alvin brought along his guitar, and then things really livened up. Alvin and Patrick even taught the sisters how to smoke. As time passed by, Johnny introduced us to Donald. and his sister Tracy Buzzy, and before long they also joined our group. Things continued to run smooth, and even now and then Johnny's two older brothers joined us in our fun. One night there was an argument between Alvin and Donald. It was over trivial matters and I did not pay much attention to them. All I can say for sure is that at the tail end of it Donald was praising his brothers Alan and another guy called Ricky. Out of character, Alvin had put him down and said that they were not as wonderful as Donald had implied. I do not know why Alvin did this, maybe it was to impress the girls. But Donald was hurt by his remarks. I from my side tried to pacify him, and that night, when we all left for home, I thought the incident was gone and forgotten. A few days later, it was during a weekday afternoon, Alvin and I went to the local barber to have our hair cut and trimmed. Right at the entrance to the barber, which was situated under Lansdowne Bridge, we ran into two guys who accosted us. They were mainly concentrated on Alvin, and from the conversation they had with him I gathered that they were the guys over which Alvin and Donald had argued the other night. I had a chance to study them and was shocked because I had recognized them to belong to that bunch of boys with whom I had that encounter with 5 years ago. I had not forgotten the punch which Reggie had given me, and I supposed I will never forget it and carry it with me to the grave. While I was still as skinny as ever, the two of them had filled out more. Apparently Donald had told them what Alvin had said about them, so they were confronting him about it and they were quite aggressive. A subdued Alvin watered down the whole incident, but they would have none of it. They told him that they must be off to attend to some urgent matters, but he can rest assured that by the time he has finished his haircut, they will be waiting for him to settle this matter, and by their tone of voice we gathered that it will not just be talking. Inside the barber Alvin was a bundle of nerves and I had to go all out to calm him down. He gave me the rundown on these guys, and what I learned from him also made me feel uneasy. I was furious with him for being so foolish as to bring the wrath of these people down on our necks after having known these salient facts about them. He suggested that we forego our haircuts and run with our tails between our legs for cover. But I would have none of it. I pointed out that it would be cowardice on our part, and besides, how will it look once the story makes the rounds? Never mind how we will be able to look our friends in the face after this. I tried to appease him by telling him not to worry and opined that they will not be waiting for us after we had finished our hair cuts. I could see that Alvin was not happy, but nevertheless he chose to stay. When it came for the turn of our haircuts, Alvin deferred to me, "Thank you very much," but when I had finished my turn and looked for him to take his, he had disappeared. It seemed that the very minute I had sat in the barber's chair and my attention was divested, he had bolted and made good his escape. I had misjudged Alvin and the Buzzies too, for when I got outside they were waiting. They demanded to know by me where Alvin was, and I told them that he had flown the coop. They were furious and decided to pick on me. It seemed that Donald had not only discussed Alvin because they knew more about me than what I would care to divulge. They told me that I am cock of the coop of the bunch and that they would like to clip my wings. Of the two, Alan was the most vociferous, outspoken, and aggressive. Both of them challenged me to a fight, which I declined. I had just learned that Ricky was a professional boxer and Alan had or was in the process of finishing his 9 months military training. To my reasoning it would be a mismatch because these guys were super fit. Besides, I did not view this as my fight, and Alvin running away the way he did had clinched it. Having decided not to fight, I was very submissive and stoically stood by while they were busy interrogating and haranguing me. It was only after I had apologized for I don't know what, that they had decided to let me go. Back home, I castigated Alvin for what he had done, To tell the truth, I was plain disgusted in him, and Patrick backed me up. Praise be to Allah, Alvin showed remorse and gave both Patrick and me the assurance that he will give a better accounting of himself in the future, which he did. That night in the Wendy house, Patrick, Alvin, and I was not at all happy to see the smirk on Donald's face. His sister Tracy also passed a remark which made a hero of her brother Alan, and which cast us in bad light. I felt ashamed in front of Johnny's sisters. And there and then I made a hard decision. I had resolved that on the morrow I will challenge Alan to a hand-to-hand combat, never mind how unpalatable it was. I had decided to clean our slate and at the same time to wipe that smirk off Donald's face. In a whispered conversation to Patrick, I told him of my decision and he decided to back me up. It was agreed that the next day we would go knocking on Alan's door and put the ball in his court. That night I had but little sleep and lay tossing and turning in my bed, thinking of tomorrow and what it held in store for me. The next afternoon after school, Patrick and I set out for Alan's house. Earlier on we had told Alvin what I had planned to do. Alvin, bless him, had tried his best to make me to change my mind. I pointed out to him that it is a matter of honor and he resolved to stand by me no matter what. We left him on standby to await further developments. When we arrived at Alan's home, I stood outside on the pavement and sent Patrick to knock on his door to tell him that I wished to speak to him. As fate would have it, Alan was home. He stayed right next to Johnny and came out immediately to see what I wanted. Without further ado, I told him that I was not happy with the way he had talked to me yesterday and challenged him to a fair fight. I was all keyed and buoyed up and did not really concentrate on him when he said to me in what seemed to me like a very calm and collected voice, "Stick around while I go inside to put on my army boots to fuck you up." I just stood there and soaked up the sun while I waited for him to come back. I did not wait long, and when he reappeared, he had his army boots on, but he was not alone. He was accompanied by Reggie and Ricky. It was the self-same Reggie who had given me that cowardly punch 5 years ago, and I recognized him instantly. I don't know if he remembered me, but he gave no sign of having done so. Alan addressed himself to me and asked where we could go for him to fuck me up, because he did not want to have any ructions in front of his house. Patrick suggested the cricket field, and we all straight away made for it. As we marched along, Alvin came running up and fell into step beside Patrick and me. This act of support from him tremendously endeared us to one another, and all was forgiven and forgotten. Although Patrick and Alvin will not be involved in the actual fighting, the moral support they gave me was enough to shore up my spirit, because it is a comforting thought to know that in the crowd there are at least somebody rooting for you. When we got to the cricket field, Alan chose to fight on the same spot that Joey did a few months ago. Once there, he did not waste any time with preliminaries but assumed a boxer's stance and came in swinging. I, not lazy myself, met him head on and we stood toe-to-toe trading punches with one another, and I gave back what I received. The fight had barely started when the same man who had broken up the fight between Joey and me arrived on the scene. He threatened to put his dogs on us if we do not stop immediately, and in a calm and collected manner he also informed us that he already had notified the police and that they were on their way. Quickly hostilities ceased and we cleared the field in a hurry. I was not disappointed in the least, because as far as I was concerned I had made my point, so I was quite prepared to let matters rest. Not so with Alan. As far as he was concerned, the two of us had some unfinished business to attend to, and he was determined to see that it gets done. The problem was the venue. We had just been chased off the cricket field, so where to now? Then Reggie came up with a solution. He suggested that tomorrow at 4 p.m. we meet at Percy's camp and finish the fight Percy's camp was a fenced-off plot which belonged to Percy's father. Reggie and company will tell the neighbors that we will be practicing for a boxing match, thereby making sure that the fight will not be interrupted or stopped. I agreed and the matter was settled. That night in the Wendy house it was a different atmosphere. Everybody knew that earlier in the day Alan and I had traded some punches and that the big fight is scheduled for the next day. I together with Patrick and Alvin felt good because we had won back the respect which we had lost yesterday. Bearing in mind that what the one does rubs off on the others, this challenge of mine to Alan had proven to all concerned that we are not cowards and will fight back if need be. Praise be to Allah, at least one objective had been achieved. To Donald and his sister Tracy, the outcome of the fight was already a foregone conclusion. Their only concern was the duration and the injuries that I will sustain. They could not decide whether I was brave or foolish to have challenged their brother to a fight. Tracy, who was fond of me, expressed the wish and hope that Alan does not hurt me very much, and according to Donald, Alan had never ever lost a fight. Alan had amply demonstrated to me that he was not going to be a pushover, so I was not at all cheered up by these talks. I had warned Patrick and Alvin not to post any pre-fight talks, so the three of us sat silently listening to them extolling Alan's prowess as a fighter. Johnny and his sisters did not pass any comments, bearing in mind that the Buzzies as well as us were their friends, but we could pick up from the vibes coming from them that their support and sentiment lied with us. This did much to bolster my confidence and morale, and I became motivated to give of my best come what may. That night before going to bed, I earnestly prayed to and beseeched Allah for help and support. I said that I have a fight on my hands with an opponent who is in much better physical shape than me, who is stronger than me, and who understands the art of fighting better than me. I asked Allah for the strength and the stamina to defeat him, but above all else I asked Allah for the knowledge to defeat him by outwitting him. I told Allah that he is not alone, that he belongs to a gang, and I fear what they will do to me if I win. I especially fear the machinations of their leader Reggie, who had already shown his mettle, which leaves much to be desired. I asked Allah for protection and aid in case of need. After this prayers I got into bed and drifted off into a deep sleep. The next day at school I was just not myself and could not concentrate on anything, because my mind was preoccupied with the upcoming fight. I envied my classmates, who were blissfully unaware of what was awaiting me. By the time the last bell was sounded, heralding the end of the school day, I still had not formulated a plan of action against Alan and if need be the rest of the Buzzy gang. Praise and thanks be to Allah, it was after I had sat down to after-school lunch, which my mother always prepares for us children, that a clear picture of what I must do dropped into my head. Immediately I started off to set the first part into motion. Straight away I made for the house of my mother's tenants, which was just up the road where I lived, and seeked an audience with Jimmy, and as luck would have it he was at home. He is the son of Mr. and Mrs. Williams, and they had moved into my mother's house a few months ago. From the moment Jimmy had laid eyes on me he had taken a special liking towards me. One day he told me that if ever I am in trouble I must not hesitate to come to him, and today that moment had arrived. I told him about the looming fight with Alan and about my fears surrounding it. I asked him to accompany me and, so to speak, to watch my back. Thanks to Allah, he promised to give me all his support. Scarcely 1 hour later I, escorted by Jimmy, Alvin, and Patrick, left for Percy's camp to keep my date with Alan. When we arrived there I was surprised to see the size of the crowd which had gathered to witness this fight. The whole Buzzy gang was out in force, trailed by their usual supporters and hangers-on. There were also other friends, acquaintances and locals from the area. It seemed that this fight had been advertised and spread like wildfire. Percy's camp was a square vacant plot situated in Civic Road. Its front faced the road, and its back abutted the homes facing the next road with its two sides wedged in between a home and an empty corner plot. The sides facing the road and the plot had a half-rusted wire fence 1 meter high strung along its boundary. Reggie expressed his surprise on seeing Jimmy, who was about his same height and build, but the latter assured him that he was only there as an observer and to make sure nobody stabs me. In the back, my escort and I had approached Percy's camp from the direction of the corner plot, and when we had navigated about half of it I spied Alan already inside the camp waiting for me. He was standing about 2 feet away from the fence and facing in our direction. The minute my eyes fell on Alan, I put the last part of my plan into motion. I started to run towards him, and the nearer I got to him the faster I ran. By the time I neared the fence I was in full flight. Just before I reached the barrier I cleared it with one leap, at the same time launching myself feet first at him. At the point of contact, my body was at a vertical angle and both my feet thudded against his chest and we both went sprawling onto the ground. To defeat Alan I had decided on shock tactics and a merciless onslaught, and by all accounts it seemed to be working, because when I had propelled myself at him, he was shocked and froze into motionless inaction. This sudden and vicious onslaught of mine had not only caught him by surprise, but the rest of the crowd, as well as the Buzzy gang, must have sensed that Alan was unnerved by my unorthodox approach and shouted out advice and encouragement from left, right, and center. We both managed to get to our feet at round about the same time, and following the advice of his cronies, Alan came rushing forward with the intention of kicking me back onto the ground and then stomping me with those army boots he had on. I did not give him any leeway to execute this intention, but met him halfway by diving for his feet and catching his foot in mid-swing, at the same time twisting it and toppling him to the ground. That day things just did not seem to be working for the Buzzies. Every advice that they shouted from the sidelines, and the most vociferous and the most forthcoming of it, emanated from Ricky and Reggie, that Alan acted upon, but ere it came off the ground I had neutralized it with a counter-offensive. Then all of a sudden, out of the blue, a voice whispered inside my head and said, "Shukri, go for his eyes, take your right hand, extend its 2 longest fingers in a rigid formation and try to poke out both of his eyes." Without thinking about the consequences I instantly obeyed the voice, which at the time I thought was my own thoughts speaking to me, and went for Alan's eyes. I had done it so quickly that before Alan could stop me my fingers were dangling about 2 inches away from his eyes. I piled on the pressure by bringing my left hand into play to help my right in its drive towards his eyes. Then there followed a titanic struggle between Alan and me. I tried my best to poke out both of his eyes, and he tried his best to prevent me from doing it. The Buzzy gang went crazy. They tried their best by shouting themselves hoarse from the sidelines, telling Alan what to do to dislodge me from my favorable position towards winning the fight. Alan paid them no heed. Instinctively he knew that if he relaxed his hold onto my hands by the minutest of a fraction to initiate a counter attack, it would be fatal, because I would have plunged out both of his eyes. Then one of the gang, I think it was Ricky, shouted stalemate, and the rest of the gang echoed his words. It was only after Jimmy had voiced the same sentiments that I eased up, and then Alan reciprocated likewise. The fight was over and we both got up from the ground where this struggle had taken place. I had just vaulted over the fence, and as I stood there dusting myself off, Reggie approached me and demanded that I fight with him. I had suspected this might happen, that is why I had brought Jimmy with me, and he did not disappoint me. Jimmy told Reggie in no uncertain terms, and he did not mince his words, that I am no match for him. Reggie, and that Reggie must leave me alone. Reggie refused to listen to Jimmy and kept demanding that I fight him. It was then that Jimmy lost his cool, and in a flash, he took off his jacket, assumed a boxer's stance in front of Reggie, and with both his fists balled challenged him to a fight, succinctly pointing out that the two of them are evenly matched. Naturally, Reggie, the coward that he was, refused, but after that he left me alone and we all called it a day. That night in the Wendy house, it was a jubilation and a celebration. Patrick and Alvin were beside themselves with happiness and could scarcely contain themselves. The whole evening they sang lively songs and Alvin played the guitar with gusto. I think Patrick had even brought a cake with him. Donald and his sister Tracy did not harbor any malice against me for trumping their brother. Instead, they congratulated me for putting up a brave fight. They, including Johnny and his sisters and whoever else were there, joined in the singing and the revelry, and all was forgotten and forgiven. I, from my side, did not really join in the sing-song and the merry-making. I was content to just sit there and lap it up, feeling secure in the knowledge that Allah Almighty had answered my prayers and that He had gifted me with two such wonderful friends in Alvin and Patrick. Suffice it to say, the evening had ended on a good note. The next day Alvin, Patrick, and I got together to discuss the follow-up to the fight. According to Alvin, it was still far from over because I did not get a pledge of peace from Alan. There and then Patrick and I resolved to go see him to find out what was finally on his mind. Immediately we set off down the road to go and look for him. When we drew near his house, he saw us and came outside to speak with me. Alan told me that I had put up a better fight than him, that he had misjudged me, and as far as he is concerned, it is over. He stuck out his hand for a handshake, I shook it and we parted in peace. A little later that same afternoon Patrick and I ran into the rest of the Buzzy gang. They were looking for me. The few of them which I recognized and knew by name were Reggie, Ricky, and Percy. When Ricky caught sight of me, he came to the forefront and demanded that I fight with him. As far as I was concerned, I had already proven my bona fides and had no inclination or intention to fight him or anybody else for that matter. Obviously Ricky did not share my opinion. For whatever reason, he had come looking for me to beat up on me, and he had come well prepared. It was not going to be a fair fight because he had put on knuckle dusters, but at first I was not aware of this fact. He put up his fists and started dancing in front of me like the real boxer that he was. Because I was not interested in any fighting whatsoever, I did not take any precautionary measures and allowed him to come in under my guard and throw a punch to my mouth which drew blood. Patrick had shouted out to me to be careful because Ricky had knuckle dusters on, but it was already too late for me to take evasive action, and I also became aware of this fact after Ricky's fist had landed. I was in real trouble and desperately looking for a way out. If I fight with Ricky, he is going to cut my face and scar me for life with those knuckle dusters, and if I do not fight him, he is still going to do the same. I was desperately in need of help, and the only one I could turn to was Alan. I lifted up my heart in prayer to him and asked him to take me out of this untenable situation. Blessed be the name of the Lord on high. Allah had listened to my prayers. Help came, and it came from a quarter which I did not expect. It was from a woman who stayed up the road from me. I only knew her as the mother of Glenn and Mary. She charged in amongst the Buzzy gang and confronted Ricky before he could strike the next blow. She told Ricky and via him the rest of the gang that they must go back to where they came from. She will not allow them to harm me, and that they will first have to get by her to do it. This woman was brave, and doubly so because she was a woman of color, and in those years people of color did not confront so-called white South Africans. Ricky and company were not prepared to fight with a woman. They left to go back where they came from, and Patrick and a very thankful me went our way. That night in the Wendy house a very upset me told what had happened. I especially directed my talk to Donald and Tracy, and I did not leave out anything. After I had finished, I asked them to deliver a message to the Buzzy gang. I said that I do not belong to a gang, but this does not mean that I am helpless and all alone. I belong to a big family who loves one another, who stand by one another, and who help one another when trouble comes a-calling. So far I had elected to do my own battles, but if pressed I will have no option but to call in the help of the wider members of my family, and I can give no guarantee once I have done this where it will stop. Tracy looked at me with those beautiful sky blue eyes of hers and said that I have all the right to feel aggrieved. She went on to say that she is the only and favorite sister of Alan, and that she is the only one in the family who has his ear. She will tell him to tell the others to leave me be, and that I can consider it a fait accompli. That was the end of it, and up until today I never ever had a problem with the Buzzy gang again. Reviewing this episode with my blinkers off, I once more discovered the helping and guiding hand of the Almighty. One after Reggie had punched me, I was saved by the timely appearance of my uncle from further assault. 2. The timely intervention of a woman saved me from serious injury by Ricky and his knuckle dusters. 3. I was guided by Allah to take Jimmy with me to the fight. This saved me from being assaulted by Reggie. 4. The help of the mysterious voice. Who or what is it must still be solved. About 3 years later, after my encounter with the Buzzy gang, Alvin and I witnessed how Alan and Ricky manhandled another man. The way they went about it, I thanked Allah in my heart that I had come off so lightly at their hands. I shared this whole episode with Charliza, and we both cried out another sign and jumped for joy.